Prynhawn da pawb. Rwy'n falch iawn i fod yma heddi i'ch diweddaru chi ar addysg yma yng Nghymru wrth i ni'n nesau at wyliau'r haf ac i edrych ymlaen at sut y gallai addysg edrych ym mis Medi. Bydd hwn yn wyliau haf haeddiannol iawn i bawb sy'n gweithio yn y maes addysg neu sy'n astudio yma yng Nghymru. Hoffwn i fanteisio ar y cyfle hwn i ymestyn diolch mawr am y gwaith anhygoel mae pawb wedi wneud i gefnogi yn dysgwyr ni, i sicrhau bod nhw'n parhau i ddysgu o dan amgylchiadau heriol, am ofalu amdanyn nhw ac am gefnogi i iechyd meddwl a chorfforol. I'd like to wish everyone working in education in Wales or studying here a big thank you for all your hard work over the last year as we approach a very deserved summer break for you all. Over the last 2 months, I've been lucky enough to visit several schools, colleges and other education settings, and it's been really valuable to be able to speak to staff and learners and to listen to the way that they've adapted to the circumstances. But also I'm grateful to them for their candour. They've been very open with me about some of the challenges that they continue to face and what we as a government can do to support them. In recent weeks, I've set out my priorities for how we renew and reform, ensuring that we continue to put learners' well-being and progression at the heart of everything that we do. And I've set out a series of measures that we'll take to ease potential pressures within the education system and to create more space where we can for staff to support learners. These include suspending performance measures and pausing school categorisation. I've also agreed the suspension of Estin's core inspection programme into the autumn term, and I will continue to work with partners on practical steps which we can take to reduce unnecessary pressures as part of our collective efforts to renew and reform. Regarding this summer's assessments, learners across Wales have already been receiving their provisional GCSE AS or A-level grades before receiving their formal and final grades in August. Unless a learner chooses to have their grades reviewed or appealed, they can be confident that the grades they are given on a provisional basis will be the grade they're given in August. So well done to all the learners who've been working hard towards their qualifications this year. And it's been a huge effort for teachers to undertake the assessment work this summer, which allows those learners to progress to their next stage in their lives with credible qualifications. And in recognition of this, we've provided more than £9 million worth of direct funding to ease the pressure on the workforce, more than anywhere else in the UK. And this is alongside a reduction in entry fees, releasing a further £9.6 million for schools and colleges. Thanks to the NHS and everyone involved in our vaccination programme, more than 2.25 million people in Wales have received their first dose, and over half the people in Wales have now received their second. There's been an increase in coronavirus case numbers in recent weeks linked to the Delta variant, and we will continue to take a cautious approach to easing restrictions. Wales currently has the lowest rate of coronavirus cases per head in any part of the UK. It's good news, particularly for education, that all education staff will have been offered a second jab by the end of September. As the number of people who are fully vaccinated will continue to rise, providing growing defences against the virus, we now need to look at what education will look like after the summer, albeit with the same cautious approach that has got us to this point. Our education sector have played their part and put in a tremendous amount of hard work to create COVID-secure learning environments. And our learners, parents and carers have also supported these efforts, including lateral flow testing and isolating when unwell. While we will not simply be back to normal by September, we will look to gradually ease the extraordinary measures we've had to put in place. Our guiding principle has to be a move towards education being enabled to operate as normally as possible in the autumn. Currently, all education settings follow national guidance. However, as we move through the pandemic, there will be a need to move to a more localised approach rather than a blanket approach. To enable this, we will publish a national framework for each education sector, which will support them to escalate and de-escalate interventions based on risk. The framework will set out a range of safety measures depending on the risk category, based on low, moderate, high and very high risk categories. In the spirit of social partnership, we are sharing draft frameworks with parents this week, with partners this week, to be further developed between now and the end of the summer term. The frameworks will allow escalation or de-escalation of measures such as testing, the use of face coverings and social distancing. It will apply to schools, colleges and universities and follows the approach already modelled in care homes. Clearly, as part of our discussions with partners, we need to be looking at the key challenges which schools, colleges and universities currently face. That includes looking at best practice across Wales to ensure that we do not have a disproportionate number of learners self-isolating. While class or year bubbles have played an important role over the last year, we need to ensure that settings distinguish between bubbles on the one hand and personal contact with cases on the other. Linked to this, we want to discuss how settings can return to their usual session times as opposed to having staggered start and finish times as currently in place. These changes do not mean a wholesale removal of mitigating measures, but they are about our schools, colleges and universities being able to make decisions based on the balance of harms and minimising disruption to learning, all within the wider context of our successful vaccine programme and relatively low case numbers. We'll continue to engage with staff and our other partners on any proposed changes, as we've done throughout the pandemic. I'll now take questions from our colleagues in the media. As usual, my answers will be available on the Welsh Government's social media channels. And to start, Bethan Lewis at BBC Wales.
Anta Gweinidog, os allech chi ateb yn Gymraeg hefyd, os gwelwch yn dda. Is it unsustainable by now for dozens of children and young people to have to isolate because of one positive case amongst their contact group or within a school? And does what you've said today mean the end of school bubbles from the autumn?
Thank you, Bethan, for that question. Well, there's a distinction, I think, to be drawn on the one hand between the numbers of people which are the individual contacts of a particular case on the one hand and a entire bubble on the other hand. And I'm really keen to make sure that we don't have a situation where schools conflate those two things, because they are importantly very separate. And so, I want to discuss as part of that set of framework discussions with our partners how we get to a place where that distinction is clear and where we can use the test, trace and protect system to further support schools in minimising the number of people, the number of students that are asked to self-isolate. There is a reasonable level of variability across Wales in the approach which schools are taking in this respect, and we want to make sure that we support schools to minimise the number of pupils that are self-isolating.
Yn Gymraeg hefyd, os gwelwch na?
Diolch, Bethan, ymddiheuriadau. Mae gwahaniaeth ar yr un llaw rhwng cysylltiadau uniongyrchol gyda rhywun sydd wedi cael achos a'r swigen gyffredinol ar y llaw arall. Ac rwy am sicrhau bod ni mewn sefyllfa lle dyw ysgolion ddim yn edrych ar y ddau peth fel tasen nhw yr un peth. Felly dyna'r rhan o'r broses dros yr wythnosau nesaf gyda'n partneriaid ni yn strwythuro'r fframwaith na nes I sôn amdano fe, yw sicrhau bod ni'n defnyddio'r ymarfer orau mewn rhannau o Gymru, sicrhau bod y lleia posib o disgyblion ni yn gorfod hunan ynysu yn sgil y trefniadau hynny.
Diolch. In some parts of North Wales, cases impacting schools are increasing, in some cases back to sort of pre-Christmas levels, with all the disruption that brings. Are you worried that in these final 3 weeks or so of term that we're inevitably going to see more cases impacting schools and more children having their education disrupted?
Well, I don't think anything in this sense is inevitable, Bethan, and that's the important thing, I think, for us to bear in mind, really. I mean, obviously, in parts of North Wales, as you say, the numbers are increasing. But I think it's important that we remember that there are steps that we can all take to minimise transmission, and those steps remain very, very important, and in fact, essential to our ability to respond to the virus, whether it's at areas where there's a low level of transmission or areas where the transmission is very high. And the comments I made during my remarks at the start is about taking an approach which is sensitive and reflects, if you like, the local conditions in any part of Wales, so that schools are able to make those judgments based on their local risk profile as advised to them by their local incident management team. Mae'r hyn ni'n gweld yn digwydd o ran y cynnydd mewn niferoedd, a mae hynny yn digwydd mewn rhan o Gymru fel ma'ch cwestiwn chi'n awgrymu, yn tanlinellu pa mor bwysig yw bod ni ddim yn edrych ar y datblygiadau yma fel pethau sydd yn anorfod, ond yn bod ni'n cofio bod camau gall pob un o'n i gymryd fel unigolion neu fel system addysg i sicrhau bod ni'n lleihau y risg o drosglwyddiant. Ac mae hynny'n bwysicach po fwyaf mae'r trosglwyddiant yn digwydd. Ond fel nes i sôn yn y geiriau ar y cychwyn, rhan o'r syniad tu ôl i'r fframwaith yma i alluogi pobl i ysgolion i symud i fyny ac i lawr drwy'r ystod o ymyrraethau yw bod hyn yn digwydd ar sail amgylchiadau lleol a'r cyngor iechyd cyhoeddus, bydd awdurdodau lleol a ysgolion yn derbyn. Diolch Bethan. Owen Phillips, ITV.
Brown chi. To go back to the bubbles question, what are the kind of model is there then to be in place? And would it fall on teachers to decide which pupils need to self-isolate and which don't?
Thanks, Owen. Well, as I mentioned briefly in passing, perhaps at the start, what I'm very clear I want to do is to explore with our partners in the education system, teachers, learners, parents and staff more broadly, about how we can make sure that the minimum number of pupils are being asked to self-isolate consistent with the level of transmission. So, you know, it ought to be the case that every learner in Wales is able to take advantage of the best practice that is certainly being followed in many, many parts of Wales. And so we want to make sure that schools are supported in order to minimise the number of pupils that are asked to self-isolate. But there are practical questions which go with that, as you'd obviously expect, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we'll be discussing with our partners over the coming weeks.
And do you have an update on vaccination plans for teenagers and those under 18, given that cases among young people are now increasing?
You're right to say that the under-25 group in particular is showing an increase in numbers. That actually is the sort of thing we would expect to see in the current circumstances. But obviously, experience in the past suggests that that can lead to transmission in other age groups. Whether that happens in the same way in this in the next few weeks and months depends obviously on the impact of vaccine and a range of other circumstances. On the question of vaccine availability for younger people, we are still waiting for the advice from the JCVI. Obviously, that will guide any decisions that we take, and that is, that's expected in the coming weeks. Diolch Owen. Abby Whittick, Wales Online.
Good afternoon, Minister. You say that schools will be moved into categories of low, high, medium risk for mitigations. Can you give us some idea of what will be looked at, what data will be looked at, what situation will be looked at, and who will have the final decision on what category a school is in?
Thanks, Abby, for that. The thinking behind the frameworks is to enable these decisions to be taken in a way which reflects local circumstances in terms of the transmission of the virus in communities which are relevant to that particular school. And so there'll be a role for public health advice, for CMO advice, but for the IMT, the local incident management team as well, to feed into the risk assessment and to identify the level of risk based on transmission in the local community. But alongside that as well, I just want to be clear, what we are talking about here is a national framework which is being applied in local circumstances, if you like. So the framework will give a level of clarity about what interventions are available to a school to consider based on those individual risk categories. And so in that sense, it also reflects not just the local circumstances, not just the advice on the local risk profile, if you like, but also Wales-wide national guidance. I think that blend is important.
So sorry, just to be really clear, so will a school be able to decide itself whether it fits the criteria for a category or someone else?
Well, as I say, the advice to the school will be based on the levels of transmission in the local community, and there's more than one source of information in relation to that. The IMT will have a fundamental role in designating the local risk profile.
Thank you. My second question is, can you ever see a situation where all schools will be asked to close again, or would you really try and avoid that as far as possible? Would we see that ever again next year?
Look, it's really, really important to me that we do absolutely everything we can to make sure that all our learners in Wales are able to spend their time where they are best able to learn, which is in school. That's absolutely what I want to see. And in fact, the measures which I'm describing to you today is designed exactly to minimise, the sort of scenario that you're describing there, which is, more pupils self-isolating than we need. The whole point of that framework is to make sure that we are keeping those numbers to a minimum, because everything we know is that learners are best supported through their education journey by being able to be in school. Thank you, Abby. Llaici Lynch, Esbydrec.
Diolch yn fawr, Gweinidog. Mae newyddion Esbydrec wedi siarad gydag athro oedd yn deud bod un dosbarth cyfan wedi gorfod hunan ynysu ar ôl i un disgybl wrthod cymryd prawf Covid-19. Beth ydych chi fel Llywodraeth am wneud i osgoi achosion fel hyn ddigwydd ledled Cymru?
Wel, diolch Llaici am y cwestiwn. Wy am sicrhau dau beth yn y cyd-destun hwnnw. Hynny yw, bod ni'n gwahaniaethu rhwng cysylltiadau uniongyrchol i rhywun sydd wedi cael achos wedi dangos ar yr un llaw, a dosbarth cyfan neu swigen gyfan ar y llaw arall. Mae'r syniad yna o swigen wedi bod yn ddefnyddiol iawn dros y flwyddyn diwetha, ond mae rhaid sicrhau hefyd bod ni'n gwneud y gwahaniaeth hynny. Felly dyna'r bwriad sydd y tu ôl i'r trafodaethau yma am y fframwaith, bod ni'n galluogi ysgolion i leihau yn gyson gyda'r risg, wrth gwrs, y rhifau sydd yn y sefyllfa honno. Ac o ran profi, ni'n annog, wrth gwrs, disgyblion ac athrawon i fanteisio ar y gallu i gael prawf. Maen nhw ar gael i bobl, a ni'n gobeithio bydd pobl yn cymryd mantais llawn o hynny.
Diolch i chi. Mae newyddion Esbydrec ar ddeall na fydd gan rai ysgolion Ynys Môn gysylltiad i'w systemau technoleg wybodaeth tan fis Medi yn dilyn ymysodiad seibr sydd wedi effeithio ar bob un o'i 5 ysgol uwchradd. Allwch chi roi diweddariad i ni ar y sefyllfa ac oes na fygythiad y bydd sir arall yn dioddef y fath ymosodiad?
Wel, rwy'n gwybod bod yr awdurdodau yn Ynys Môn wedi bod yn gweithio yn gyflym iawn ac yn derbyn cyngor arbenigol iawn i edrych i mewn i hyn, a bydd datganiadau pellach maes y law yn dod wrth y cyngor lleol, wrth gwrs. Ond ran ni fel Llywodraeth, ni wedi bod yn cefnogi y cyngor lleol yn Ynys Môn, a hefyd sicrhau bod ni'n cael trafodaethau. Wrth gwrs, ni'n ymwybodol iawn o'r risg i bob rhan o'r gwasanaeth cyhoeddus o ymysodiadau cyber, felly ni'n gweithio i sicrhau bod yn gallu ni i ymateb i hynny fel gwasanaeth cyhoeddus y gorau gallu fod, a hefyd sicrhau bod ni'n cymryd camau i osgoi bod y pethau yma'n digwydd hefyd yn y dyfodol. Diolch Llaici. And Dan Wilson, LBC.
Thank you, Minister. I just wanted to come one last time back to the issues of bubbles in the new academic year. Is there not an argument for there is simply no need for any sort of self-isolation come September, given the fact that by then most adults in Wales under the Welsh Government's targets will have been fully vaccinated, and the risk then of passing it on falls. The risk to children has always been very low. So is there not even a need perhaps for a local approach to this and just ignoring self-isolation come that point?
Well, look, we want to make sure that every step that we take provides the schools with the appropriate range of measures to ensure that we can combat the virus. And so what I'm describing today provides a level of flexibility in the system, if you like, to reflect those local circumstances. By the end of September, all school staff will have been offered a vaccine. And so I think that does, of course, provide a level of comfort. But I think what's also been clear is that we need to be able to take these things a step at a time. And so I hope that we will be able to discuss with our partners in the coming week a framework which is proportionate to the level of risk in any individual school and provides that school with a flexible toolkit, if you like, to be able to respond to those circumstances.
Thank you. And Flintshire's 7-day COVID infection rates is now about 3 times higher than the Wales-wide infection rates. Many put that down to the fact that it is on the border with England and the hotspot areas that are nearby in the northwest of England. The First Minister said a couple of weeks ago that he'd ruled out any sort of travel ban between the two countries. But if those numbers continue to rise and if hospitalisations start going up, how flexible is that regulation in order to protect not just the public, but also the economy in the long run?
Well, I just reflect the First Minister's words, really. The bars for those sorts of interventions are obviously set very high, aren't they, for the reasons that he will have described at the time. But again, I think, at the heart of what I was describing earlier is a sort of local approach to schools being able to reflect their local risk profile. And different parts of Wales, different communities at various points will have different levels of transmission in their local communities. And so I'm keen, as Education Minister, to put the tools for responding to that in the hands of schools to reflect those particular circumstances that they face. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.